Okay. What did you think of the exam? You see, in general, seem to be doing much better on this exam than the last one. What did you think? You didn't understand the tree till you did your lab, so maybe it would be better to have the lab before the exam. Okay. Okay. Yeah. 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 Oh yeah, you'll definitely. I'm on the S's right now. So and the other key thing is the inquisitive module is due tonight if you're going to do it. And remember, you get 2 extra credit points if you do it. So I can't really compile the final grades until tomorrow. So they should be, I'll be definitely done grading the exams, and I just have to wait to add the bonus points in. So, yep. Yep, there are only 3. So we're now, so yeah, so the inquisitive module, if you want to do that, you can get 2 extra credit points. So, okay. So I'll definitely have the exams, I think graded today, but by tomorrow morning, so. So now we're no longer using the textbook. So we're now moving into the third part of the course, which is ecology. And all of the readings are on Moodle. What I've done is I've scanned in parts of chapters so you can get around copyright laws if you just photocopy part of a chapter. So I uploaded those onto Moodle, and you'll see those in each section, so each week. And then I'll post the PDFs and PowerPoints too. So we're going to try to go through 1 through 3. I'm not sure I'm going to get through 1 through 3, and I might just do a real short 10 to 15 minute video of the last part, but I'll see how it goes. Okay. So what we're going to do, we're going to start on today is studying ecology. Does that mean anything to you guys? What does that mean? What's ecology? Yeah. It's kind of the study of organisms, maybe, living in communities and how they interact with one another, whether it's, a wolf eating, eating something or something eating plants, and interactions among organisms in an ecosystem. And I am not going to shy away from talking about how humans influence ecosystems, right? And how humans influence global patterns. And we're going to be pretty straightforward about that humans, in fact, do influence ecosystems quite a bit. We have a major influence on natural ecosystems, and there's also this sort of romanticized view about nature, right? That if humans have no influence on nature, it'll kind of go back to a self-restoring equilibrium that is much better. And I think a lot of what we do when we preserve parks and things like that, we try to minimize human interference, but again, it's hard to prevent human interference, right? Because you have a lot of global things that influence the availability of water. You have things that influence the availability, of temperatures increasing and all these sorts of things. So my view is pretty simple that, this sort of view that does nature go to what is called a self-restoring equilibrium when not influenced by humans? I consider this kind of a naive view, right? And humans do have a major influence on ecosystems. And again, my arguments, I care about animals, I care about plants, I care about natural communities, right? But we have to recognize that we live in a place where we're going to influence those, and I think my view is we try to minimize our influence as much as possible. And humans have influenced, even before the Industrial Revolution, humans have had a huge influence on natural ecosystems, even before that time, right? So anyway. Here's a picture of I think this is in Costa Rica. Here's a female tropical biologist, and she's out in the middle of this tropical rainforest studying various sorts of things. And or this could be in Amazonia, and people could envision that that's sort of a natural ecosystem that, is not perturbed by humans and things like that. And do you think that's true? Probably not. So it's very clear that Amazonia especially has undergone a lot of changes, both due to natural climate change, but also human influences, and the effects have been pretty dramatic. And what we see now is probably the influence of major influences by humans, and it's hard to really find. There are a few sort of remote, unique ecosystems with minimal human influence, but again, I think it's very important for us to understand. And there are lots of different political views about this, and I'm not here to preach or anything about that, but what I hope you get out of this is an appreciation for the incredible diversity, the incredible interconnections between things and interdependence between things, and that I hope this is something worth sustaining. Okay. So we're going to talk a lot about ecological systems. The last third of the course is basically going from lower ecological systems to much more higher, more complex ecological systems. So at the bottom we have what we call organismal ecology, and that's what we'll be doing today. And this is often the exchange of energy and materials with the environment and the survival and reproduction of individuals of a particular species, right? And this is kind of where we talk about how individual organisms, particular species interact with the environment. It influences their survivorship and reproduction. And this is often the unit of natural selection. We often study behavior, how organisms respond to variation in the environment, and all these sorts of things. We can then move up to the next higher level, which is a population, which is an aggregate of these individuals, right, that live together. And I'm not sure exactly what that organism is. I think it's supposed to be a prairie dog, but it doesn't look like a prairie dog to me. But anyway, you can see here that what we're looking at is here's an individual. There's a group of individuals living in this sort of arid ecosystem, probably out in the plains of North America. And we're looking at the population dynamics. So one of the things we can do, and we'll be doing, is characterizing how do populations grow, shrink, remain stable, and what are the influences on that. And this is a very important thing when we think about, conservation of endangered species, when we think about, things that we like to eat, and like sustainable how do we sustain fisheries, right? So we don't cause extinctions of things, and how do we maintain, even though we use them, we try to maintain them at a stable level, right? And so that we can continue to use them and all those sorts of things. So understanding population dynamics, that is the change in numbers of individuals of a population over time or across space, is a very important area. Community is interactions among populations or interactions among species, and this is often what we call the unit of biodiversity. We're often looking at various communities. And then at the next highest level is sort of ecosystem level and biosphere. And of course, this is the primary emphasis. What group of scientists is really interested in these sorts of things? Huh? Yeah, evolutionary somewhat, but now some other group of scientists. There are a lot in the press recently. Yes, and climate scientists, right? So yeah. Climatologists, climate scientists, people who are really looking at the flux of energy and the cycling of nutrients, and especially at the biosphere level, sort of global processes, right? How do we characterize the patterns of global warming, changes in, air temperatures, changes in sea temperatures, how that varies across the globe, and how do we come to the conclusion, right, that global warming is accelerating, that we think we have a major influence on it? What are the data that we use to come to that conclusion? And I would argue that, most climate scientists agree that this is a real problem. And I'm going to show you some data at the end, that how we use long-term data to look at trends. It's not just, oh, it was, warm this, this season, right? Or it was really cold this winter. That doesn't mean anything. So we have to look at what are called long-term trends. Nature oscillates, varies a lot, and so what we really have to look at are sort of long-term trends in patterns of carbon dioxide production over time and how we measure that and how that's linked to temperature. So anyway, this is kind of where we're going to be going. We'll be dealing with organismal today, population, community, and then ecosystem and biosphere level at the end. Okay, but a lot of these things can be talked about. There are a lot of interactions between them. Okay, so this is just to emphasize that when we look at any particular place, it's complex, okay? Let's be quite honest, right? So the way I think about this, where I would think about this would be like California. So here's the Pacific coast, And as you go from the Pacific across the mountain ranges of the Sierra Nevadas or even the coastal range, you get a lot of these patterns, right? And so there's a lot going on here, isn't there? And again, I'm not going to ask you to tell me in depth about everything that's going on in this. This is just to illustrate a very important point, that different parts of the biosphere are linked together by the movement of air, water, and organisms and all kinds of things. And humans have an influence on this, right? So let's look along here, along this coastal plain, right? If you have agricultural systems, right? There are a lot of agricultural systems in California. Often there's agricultural runoff, and this can be soil that's carried, from the agriculture sector into streams and rivers, and it empties into the ocean, right? And this is common and that sort of thing. And agricultural runoff, what are we often concerned about? Not only the loss of soil and things like that, but what are some other things we might be interested in? Yeah, so a lot of it is, especially nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus that are leached out of the soils into the system, and what influence does that have on those aquatic organisms living in these freshwater streams, and then also when it empties into the ocean. And of course, we're concerned about that around here, aren't we? So as the Mississippi River water empties into the Gulf, right, there's a huge amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, excess fertilizers, excess nutrients, and it creates, algal blooms and all these sorts of things. So it's clear there are lots of interactions, okay? But also the other thing is you have a lot of movement of animals between ecosystems and part of the biosphere, right? So often you have migrations of, what are, marine fishes. And I don't know too many whales that do this. I was kind of surprised to see this in here. But when you think about migrations of fishes from marine waters into freshwater systems, right? And you can think of salmon doing that. So there's a lot of movement of individuals between what are really kind of unique, different ecosystems, but individuals can move between them, right? And you can imagine when an organism moves from a marine ecosystem into a freshwater system, what do you think that the environment's different? And what's the big difference, do you think? Temperature is going to be one of the big things, right? The other thing that's going to be is salinity, right? So you're moving from, high salinity to marine environments into basically, as you go up the, so as you have a lot of differences here. This is mostly freshwater, no salinity, very low sodium levels. As you get in here, you get slightly higher levels, right? And then as you get out into the marine waters, that's where you get the highest salinity, right? Yeah. Yeah, yep. So again, yeah, you do, so yeah. Yeah, yeah, yep. So you do have a lot of movement of organisms from marine ecosystems through estuarine systems into freshwater systems, and obviously Pontchartrain is a classic example of that. You get a lot of, kinds of organisms that are moving between this. Occasionally we find a manatee, and they're not going to do too well. Okay, okay. The other thing that's really important, obviously you have movement in industrial waste. That's obviously, that's an important influence, on ecosystems and things like that. And you have a lot, movement of water from the land to the ocean, but a lot of movement of individuals, of, organisms just don't stay in one place, especially highly mobile things. So you can have movement of migrating birds, movement of terrestrial animals. And obviously this thing right here, this prairie dog or whatever it is, this burrowing animal, right? It has a huge influence on its local ecosystem, right? It's bearing things, it's making these burrows, it's moving soil, and that influences kind of the soils and plants that surround it, right? And creates kind of new places for them to live. The other big thing is, what happens at a much higher level as, systems move off the ocean inland, right? So you have these clouds, right? And where do you notice? Where's most of the rain occurring? It's kind of on this side of the mountain. And where do people ski in California? Do they ski on the eastern side of the Sierra Nevadas or on the western side of the Sierra Nevadas where Nevada is closer? Do you know? On the eastern side, okay? That's where they got all the rain. That's where they got incredible amounts of snow this year, right? Is that as this sort of warm clouds and warm air comes off the Pacific, right, it hits this high mountain range and it gets cooler and it condenses, and we'll talk about the process, but the outcome is rain as that warm air cools. And it always happens here. And then on the other side, what's on the other side? You ever been to Nevada? It's dry, there's no rain, it's basically almost it's a cold desert. Yeah, Yeah. So the leeward, however warm ocean air moves across a system on a high mountain range, right, you're going to lose water on that side, and on the other side, usually what you get is extremely dry environments. So that real simple process, right, can lead to very moister, wetter environments and extremely dry environments just on the other side. So all these sorts of things influence the complexity of sort of these sorts of things. And obviously you have evaporation of water, and we'll be talking about a number of those things. Okay. So this is just a kind of, so here's something we might think about like what might be more sort of a biosphere level approach. Do you know what that thing is? What's this? Here's the United States. There's Florida, right? What do you think the red represents? Yeah, that's water temperature, okay? And what you'll notice is, they're actually predicting this year, have you heard, extremely warm Gulf temperatures, even higher than we've seen. So, right. So they're anticipating, NOAA is anticipating much higher Gulf of Mexico water temperatures, and that doesn't make us happy, does it? Okay. So anyway, but the key thing here is there's a Gulf Stream. There's a current of water, right, called the Gulf Stream, and it originates out of the tropics. It's a warm current, and it obviously goes a long distance, right? And so a lot of what we might be this warm Gulf Stream affects a large area, and the movement of air and water and the energy and chemicals they contain over the surface of the earth. But this is basically looking at the temperature of this current. You can find these kinds of currents. This is one of the more dramatic ones throughout all the oceans, right? Some circulate one way, some circulate the other way. And one of the things that global climatologists are really interested in is, how are those water temperatures being affected by global warming, and is this going to become more dramatic? So, and this is, this requires amassing a lot of data, right? Measuring all these things and buoy systems and all sorts of things to gather all this information. Okay. So this warm Gulf Stream affects large areas. So you can think, look at this. This is the Gulf Stream running up, obviously, along the eastern coast, and then it goes out this way, right? And where does it kind of run by? What's up in here? Huh? Yeah, it's hitting some cold water, but, this is a lot of cold water up here, right? But then it's this warm Gulf water, this Gulf Stream is getting pretty close to it, right? Because nope. Oh no. Oh, Bermuda's down here. This is Canada. What's over here? Yeah. Yeah. Iceland's close. Oh, come on. What was our recent holiday we had? There you go, Ireland. Okay, so St. Patrick's Day. Okay. So the Gulf Stream has a huge moderating influence on Ireland's its climate. If that Gulf Stream weren't there, what do you think Ireland would be? A lot colder. Okay, so it has the presence of the Gulf Stream has a huge moderating effect on sort of the air temperature and everything around Ireland. Okay. You're not going to have to remember any of this, so this is just fun stuff to talk about. Okay. The other thing we're going to be doing and spending a lot of time on a little bit later is different organisms really have different functions, or what we call niches in natural ecosystems, right? And of course, I'm not going to go through all of this, but some of the key things are these group of organisms, from red algae to green plants, which are autotrophs or photosynthetic organisms. Green and red algae are especially important as the primary producers in aquatic ecosystems, both freshwater and marine ecosystems. And green plants are extremely important in terms of autotrophs, photosynthesizers, and all those sorts of things, and carbon capture in terrestrial systems. Okay, so they're responsible for fixing most of the organic carbon in the biosphere. This is from, what year is this? 2010? That probably needs to be modified a little bit, because it's become very clear that there is an incredible amount of carbon fixation in marine ecosystems, and it was completely unappreciated, okay? And these may be places where, well, if we can increase that amount of production, it might have some consequences, but it could also be a way to minimize the amount of carbon dioxide. So there are lots of people who are interested in all these kinds of things as ways to fix this excess carbon to, prevent global warming. And they're thinking of a lot of innovative ways of trying to do that. So these are obviously very important. Obviously, they had the origin of various kinds of organelles that are important in photosynthesis, right? So these sorts of things. And then fungi we'll be spending a lot of time looking at. These are primarily terrestrial, what we call heterotrophic. So when we talk about heterotrophic, what do we mean by that? Yeah, things that eat other things. These are not things that, fix carbon or produce oxygen. They're not photosynthetic. They're things that actually consume other things and that sort of thing. And so fungi are primarily these heterotrophic organisms that are of critical importance in recycling plants in ecosystems. And of course, many of them are pathogenic, nasty. Some are symbiosis, and then there are all the animals. So these we'll be looking at. All of the various sorts of niches and diversification that we've seen in animals and fungi and plants. And so this author is suggesting that animals, the complexity and mobility have led to sort of these remarkable diversification of animal life, right? And as we look at functions and structures of animals and the things that they do, that diversification led by speciation processes, what's generated a lot of the biodiversity that we see. So we'll spend some time on that. So what's that? Okay. That's a fungus. Is that the main component of that fungus? Well, that's what we always see in the grocery store, right? Is there something else going on that's really important here, though? The question is what's down in here, right? These are all the fruiting bodies, right, of the fungi. These are the things that we eat, right? And some fruit underground, and truffles and things like that are kind of the tubers underground. But this is the above ground sort of reproductive part of a fungus, right? The important thing to remember about fungi is, all this leaf material, all these limbs, all these, trees that have fallen, right? They're decomposed, right? And some of the most important things are this vast network of mushroom, and the parts of it are the mycelia that live underground that really are playing an important role in the decomposition of all this plant material, and is an important component of sort of the richness and diversity of these complex soils. And this is one of the great mysteries in ecology right now, is what's actually going on in soils, and nobody knows very well. You know what the other great mystery is right now? What's going on in your gut. And all of the bacteria, all the various species of bacteria that live in there, and how they interact with one another as a community. And this is called microbiomics. So there's a huge interest in biology in these sorts of biomes of microbes that live in soil ecosystems, these community assemblages of microbes that live in your gut, and how this influences all sorts of things in terms of when you feel bad, when antibiotics clear out your gut community, right, pretty much, and then you have to be recolonized and you get all these new things, and that's probably why you feel so bad. There's a lot of evidence that a lot of these microbes may play a role in terms of interactions in promoting diseases and all sorts of things. So anyway, there's a lot going on, and especially on microbes. So here we'll just this is just a fun part. Habitats. Here's a tropical rainforest. Here's a tropical seasonal forest. If you were to go down to, have you ever been to Central America in Panama or Costa Rica? Okay. So you start on the Pacific coast of Costa Rica and you go across the big mountain range and you go over to the eastern side, which is the Caribbean side, right? So the Pacific and Caribbean, that Isthmus of Panama. Where do you think either one of these is located? Where do you think the tropical forest is? Yeah, it turns out it's actually on the Caribbean side, okay? The tropical seasonal forests are on the western side, on the Pacific side of Costa Rica. And I'm not going to go into all the reasons why that is, but these forests are very different from one another. This is a tropical forest, right? the wet season is primarily during the winter time, and the dry season, no, I'm sorry. The dry season is during the winter time, and the wet season is during the summertime, okay? And so during that dry season, they basically lose a lot of their leaves, okay? And they're not this rich, lush forest. So this is a very small country. As you go across that mountain range, you have completely different kinds of tropical forest ecosystems that have all kinds of different species of plants and animals in them, okay? And so that's kind of, so how does that, why do you get different kinds of things in different places like this? Obviously, here we're looking at animals, these heterotrophs, and of course we know that organisms, heterotrophs, have a lot of distinct niches, functions in terms of where they get their energy, right? And so here's a Peruvian katydid, these things right in here, and they're primarily leaf chewers, they're herbivores, right? So they eat plant material. They're often fairly specific in terms of the kinds of specific plant species they eat. You'll notice, do they look kind of colorful too? And what do you think that would signal? Toxicity, right? Probably things don't eat these things because they're this bright yellow, and they may get that toxicity from that particular host plant that they specialize on. And this is a lot of what we see is a lot of, you know, these herbivores, especially in the tropics, are fairly specific in terms of the kinds of things they eat, right? And they probably diversified, you know, based on the host plants that they eat. This is an ichneummonid wasp. And what do you think that does for a living? And what's the thing that really strikes you as odd? Well, the antennae do, but look at the other end. Yeah. These are parasitoid wasps. Remember the example in class? These are, ichneummonid wasps are the major wasp parasitoids in the world. They're all over the place. And basically what they do, that's a female. What's she doing with this? This is called her ovipositor. You'll see it's very long. She tries to get into places where she injects her eggs into beetle larvae. Often these things specialize on particular beetle species, and there's a lot of diversification in ichneumonids based on the kinds of things they specialize on. So obviously this is a very, kind of a unique niche, unusual niche, where it uses this long ovipositor to lay its eggs in its host larvae. Okay. You want a little extra credit? Okay. What is this? Do you know what these are called? Food web, good. Don't say food chain. Chain is linear. This is not linear. This is fairly complex. Okay? So human activities often have complex effects on ecosystems because you have a lot of different levels of an ecosystem, from a top-level predator to a medium-level predator to, you know, kind of the base of the food web. Okay? And so let me just kind of go through parts of this, and then I'm going to ask you a question, and you can work in a group. So let's look at the two main components. Who are the two main top-level predators in? This could easily be off the coast of California. It could be off the coast of Peru in South America. Okay, either place. Who are the two top-level predators in this ecosystem? Killer whales and humans. Humans not so much anymore, but there was a time when humans were doing a lot. And remember, we talked about the sea otters. So, okay, so killer whales, what you can see is each line, what does each line represent when an arrow goes in a particular direction? Killer whales eat sea lions, right? Killer whales eat sea otters. Why is this one solid and this one dashed, do you think? Which is its primary food source? Yeah, seals and sea lions are the primary food source in this ecosystem. And they, on occasion, not very often, if they get lucky or, you know, they're starving, they might try to go after a sea otter. But they're pretty small. They'd rather, and we'll be talking about this next time, profitability and optimal foraging. This is their preferred prey, okay? Obviously, these seals and sea lions then eat what? fish, right? That's what they depend upon. So this is kind of the lowest level. And we still don't have any plants in here, do we? And of course, oh well, they didn't tell you what fish are eating. So, but it turns out they're probably might be eating other smaller fishes. They might be eating phytoplankton, but it's not really important. Okay. You'll notice another thing, though. What's this thing? Nurture. It took me a while to figure this one out. So this is going from the kelp to the fish. What does that mean, do you think? That's their home, yeah. So you can think about this. This is probably these kelp forests. You know, if you go along the coast of Monterey, north of San Francisco, all along the coast, the central coast of California, right? You see these floating mats, right? And they're called kelp forests. And they're one of the main marine plants in that ecosystem, right? And so this is a place where a lot of these fish spend their time foraging or hiding out, right? But it's also a place where all of their offspring live during their initial stages. So it's kind of the nursery grounds of these fish right here, okay? Now let's go to the other ecosystem, the other part of the system, and this is the case in humans, probably in the early 1900s up to about 1930. Humans hunted a lot of sea otters there and almost drove them to extinction. So this is kind of looking at what happens when humans were putting a lot of hunting pressure on sea otters, okay? So when you look at this, sea otters, right, what are they eating? They're eating these commercial shellfish, abalone, which are good, or lobsters, and then also urchins, sea urchins, okay? So, and then what are urchins eating? They're eating the kelp, okay. So here you have kind of a linear function, right? Humans hunt sea otters, then sea otters eat urchins, and then urchins eat kelp. Yeah. 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 So sea otters, obviously sea otters use it also as a refugia, right? Where they can get into that kelp forest and probably avoid predation. So that's, yep, okay. Okay, let me ask a simple question. Tell me, you can work in a group, worth 1 bonus point. What is the consequence? Describe to me, what is the consequence of high rates of human predation on sea otters on these lower levels? Specifically tell me, what is the effect on urchins, and then what is the effect on kelp, and how might that influence the fish? Okay? So you might ask, is it negatively, then positive? So I'm asking, what's happening when sea otters are reduced in density on these different lower levels? Okay? Can I repeat the question? Okay. So what is the effect when 1920s, when humans reduced sea otter density to a huge level, right? What is the effect of that reduction of that sea otter populations on urchins, kelp, and fish? Okay. And so you might say negative, positive, negative, you know, something like that. This shouldn't take long. All you have to do is put urchins, kelp, fish, and say plus, negative, no change. Or however, you can write it. You can write it out if you started that way. Yeah. Bad idea. I mean, other than they use it in zoos or something. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what their purpose is. I I have nothing against trying to do it. I have no problems trying to do it. I don't understand ultimately why. So, I mean, I don't know if they're planning to reintroduce it somewhere. But everybody done? Last call. Nope. Okay. Okay, everybody done? So this is what's called cascading. So what happens to urchin populations after that huge reduction in sea otter density? Huge explosion. Guess what happened to kelp forests? Decimated, overgrazing. What do you think happened to the fish populations? Decline. Simple as that. All you really have to know, and the magnitude of it, there can often be a lot of responses to that, right? In that, as you can imagine, that may not be sustained. As that urchin population overgrazed the kelp population, that might cause a dramatic decline of the urchin population. Kelp might have recovered a little bit, and then they would try. So we'll be talking a lot about these oscillations and these coupled population dynamics in these sorts of, especially these herbivore-plant interactions. So we'll be spending some time on that sort of thing. Okay. So, and then you could actually then extend it up that other chain, right, in terms of what the potential outcome might be. Okay. But the primary thing, it turned out, one of the primary influences was on the sort of that right side of the food web, is where the dramatic decline in kelp forests, and that was pretty negative. Okay. Okay, let me stop. This is